We now go to Ben Lake.
Diolch, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to follow my constituency neighbour, the Honourable Member for Brecon and Radnorshire, and a pleasure to speak today in support of several amendments which I believe will improve the welfare of both serving soldiers and former service personnel. And as we are in Armed Forces Week, I'd like to pay tribute not only to the tireless campaigning of organisations like the Royal British Legion, but also to veterans in my own constituency of Ceredigion. And in that respect, I'd like to pay particular tribute to the efforts of the Ceredigion Armed Forces Community Covenant, and especially Captain Colin Jones MBE and his work with the Ceredigion Armed Forces Veterans Hub. Together, they run regular breakfast hubs across the county and have organised a series of events to raise money for good causes, the most recent of which took place just last Saturday, in which Colin climbed the Rwyddfa, the highest mountain in Wales, blindfolded in aid of Blind Veterans UK, a feat that was followed in the evening by a friendly, very competitive football match between the Old Boys of Aberystwyth AFC and the Old Boys from the Royal Welsh Regiment. But, Madam Chair, I'd firstly like to voice my support of New Clause 1, which would amend the Immigration Act 2014 to waive the unjust fee levied on current or former serving members of the UK Armed Forces and their families when they submit applications for indefinite leave to remain. Now, such a measure would cost very little. I know it has support on both sides of the House and would have a profound impact on those affected, and would also, of course, signal this place's support for service people and their families. Furthermore, I'd welcome Amendments 1 to 4, and in particular Amendment 2, which would require the Welsh Government to pay due regard to the Armed Forces Covenant. I believe this amendment is crucial to ensure that access to housing and other sources of well-being for veterans in Wales, while respecting the devolution settlement. It's important because although the armed forces are clearly a reserved matter, many aspects of their care, from housing to healthcare and education, matters that have already been discussed by other members this afternoon, are devolved with responsibility for their implementation either lying with the Welsh Government or at a local authority level. It's therefore essential that we establish what expectations this bill places on the Welsh Government and local authorities. And with that in mind, I do hope the Minister might raise this in his response and inform us what discussions he's had with the Welsh Government to streamline access to these services and ensure parity across the four nations, particularly given that not all armed forces charities and support networks have at the moment as strong a presence in some parts of Wales as we would like. Equally, I would like to ask the Minister to respond to the Senedd's Legislation, Justice and Constitution Committee's report on this bill and its recommendation that amendments should be pursued that would require the Secretary of State to obtain the consent of Welsh ministers before issuing or revising guidance under new section 343AE, as well as before making regulations under new section 343AF. Now, this is particularly important given that the government is no longer seeking a legislative consent motion from the Senedd, and so if the Minister were able to refer to these points when he's summing up, I'd be very grateful. I'd also like to use this opportunity to commend the amendments tabled by my honourable friends in the SNP, which require accommodation provided to service people in their respective nations of the UK to meet certain standards. Madam Chair, I think it's appalling that while this government oversees procurement disasters, trumpets budget increases and lauds the sacrifices made by our armed forces, it is still to commit to providing basic standards of accommodation for our service people. Now, these amendments would address this, and I urge the government to support it. And finally, Madam Chair, I'd just like to note my support for New Clause 2, which would establish a duty of care standard to legal, pastoral and mental health support for service personnel in investigations or litigation arising from overseas operations. Establishing such a duty of care in these instances is the responsible and right thing to do. To conclude, then, that the new clauses and amendments that I've referred to today, I believe will make a meaningful impact on the lives of current and former service personnel. I know that they are all very considered and brought forward in good faith, and I hope the government will be able to make use of the goodwill that is apparent from both sides of the House to ensure that this bill works with the devolved governments to improve the standards of care and the support to our armed forces community. Diolch.